what are the risks of holding shares in a startup company? What's the likelihood that the business is actually going to continue and perform well? It's probably more risk associated with that than, being involved in a share scheme or an employee share scheme that is an established business that has a track record.
Yep.
Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics such as investing, cash flow, budgeting, saving, passive income, debt management, and much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I'm Billy and I'm joined by my co-host,
Andrew. Bills, here we are back again, back in the green room, talking about another topic for all of our listeners and viewers.
Andrew, it is definitely our favourite part of the week, talking on the podcast to everybody. And what are we talking to everybody about today?
Yeah, so today we're talking about something that we've been getting a few inquiries about from a few of our clients, and talking about employee share plans. So talking about what are they, how does it work, is it worthwhile participating in it, and just generally having a conversation around it.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting topic and really timely as well too, because the employment market is really tight. So from an employer's perspective, if you're trying to attract the right talent, how do you do that? And one of the things that we're coming across a little bit more frequently is these employee share schemes, just to try and, I guess, sweeten the deal. But there are some good parts to it and there are some bad parts, which we're going to go through now. And hopefully we give everybody an insight into this world that, may not necessarily be something that you'd ordinarily come across.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Andrew, lead us in. What are they?
So, look, an employee share plan is effectively a business will offer, so a business that you're working in offers you shares in the company, usually as a means to, attract, retain and motivate employees. Now, it usually is something that's either linked to a performance bonus. So if you hit a certain metric, then you have some shares that are on offer instead of actually physically paying out a bonus. Or sometimes it's offered just as a part of a normal course of business. The other thing that usually will happen is, which we'll talk a little bit about later, is the business is offering it as an incentive to purchase the shares. And so they're usually offering these shares at a discount to employees of the company.
Yeah, I mean, I like the general concept. If you think about it from a company's perspective and from a cultural point of view, if everybody kind of has skin in the game, so to speak, and everybody benefits from the company prospering, I guess on the surface, it sounds really great because everybody's working towards a common goal and a common objective. I really like that idea because it helps align everybody and they're all in the same boat, if that kind of makes sense. So there's this huge push, I guess, by the entire company to be able to do it. And we've seen that work really, really well overseas, especially in things like startup land and things like that, where maybe the company doesn't have the resources to pay top dollar to attract the right type of talent. So they'll offer these, and then all of a sudden you get this sort of really fantastic culture and everybody's pushing towards this common goal. So I like it conceptually. However, we'll dig a little bit deeper and peel back the layers of the onion just to find out, because there can be things that people need to be aware of when it comes to these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, conceptually it makes a whole lot of sense. It means that, the employees of the business have an incentive now to actually make the business work better, be more efficient and increase in value, in particular when you're talking about startups and the opportunity that's present there. You're talking about a smaller business and every single employee has a tangible impact on the business and the value of the business. Maybe a different story when you're talking about significantly larger scale businesses. But that's why you see a lot of CEOs paid in shares, because then what's happening is their interests are, in essence, aligned with the interests of the shareholder as well.
Yeah. No, absolutely like it. Andrew, usually an employee share scheme, at least in terms of the ones that I've come across, are usually part of a remuneration package when somebody joins the business.
Yeah.
So it could be used as, I guess, a tool to help incentivize top talent come across to the business. So that's definitely one way to do it. Another way is if you want to try and put some sort of performance metric there and say, okay, if we achieve a certain goal, you'll then receive certain shares or whatever it may be. So these things can be quite flexible as well too. And I think as we're starting to see that they're becoming more and more common, I think businesses are becoming more flexible in terms of how they use these to help incentivize their workforce.
Yeah, and look, it can be a really attractive means for a business because, as you sort of mentioned earlier, you're not physically needing to pay that money out. You're offering, new shares to employees, and so as a result, it doesn't actually impact the cash flow position of the business. But then on the flip side, from a business perspective, you're also diluting the shareholding of the existing shareholders.
Yep.
So anytime that you're offering new shares and anytime that you're, offering people shares in the business, you're in essence creating more shares, which is making the existing shareholding a little less valuable. Maybe not as huge of a consideration in a significantly larger business, but in smaller businesses, if you're constantly issuing new shares, you're diluting the value of the existing shares as well.
Yeah, and that's probably a good conduit into some of the cons associated with this as well too. Where we might start, I think you've really highlighted that one quite nicely. I guess just on that point, if you're a really rapidly growing business, so let's think Silicon Valley type of tech businesses that go from this to tens of thousands of % growth, you can afford to do that because even if you continue to dilute people's shares, the shares are getting much more valuable. So it works out and we end up with these tech billionaires and stuff. That's the way that it happens. But probably one of the things that I want to draw attention to is when businesses do this, I think in all of the ones that I've seen have got what they call a vesting period. Yeah. So it's not like, okay, Andrew, come and join our business. Here's 10,000 shares in the business and away you go. And you say, okay, $10,000 multiplied by the share price that it's trading at today. Fantastic. I've just received $200,000, right? Yep. There are restrictions on that. And it's termed a vesting period or a vesting date. You want to run us into what that looks like?
Yeah. So look, a vesting period is essentially you don't physically get the shares until a certain time period has elapsed. So, some companies will have a 12-month vesting period. So, 360 will say, yep, there's shares that have been on offered as a part of a bonus or as a part of remuneration or whatever it is. But you need to stay within the business. You need to essentially hold on to those shares for at least 12 months until you can actually access those shares, if there's a 12-month vesting period. Yeah. Now, some businesses will do it slightly differently. They might say, 25% within the first 6 months, 50% after 12 months, and 100% after 2 years. But so every structure is going to be slightly different. But a vesting period is basically a time period that needs to go past or needs to elapse until you actually physically have ownership and control over those shares.
Yeah, and once again, sort of going back to the flexibility, it's up to every particular business to try and figure out how that works and trying to manage that the best way as you possibly can to make it work for your particular business, your particular industry, and what it is that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and look, from a business perspective, they want to, particularly if you're offering shares at discounted, valuations to what the actual share price is, you want to avoid the fact that, I'm going to offer this employee, 1,000 shares and it's going to be worth, pick a number, $1, so $1,000, but I'm going to offer it at a discount and they're only going to, be purchasing it at $800. Yep. You want to avoid the fact that they're going to say, oh, yep, cool, give me the shares, I'll take the shares, and then the next day go and sell it and all of a sudden, they've made an extra $200 from day one. So that's one of the main reasons that a vesting period will be there, is so that they can avoid the fact that, you're going to take the shares, sell it, and essentially move on with the profit. You need to hold it for a long period of time before you actually can do anything like that.
Yeah, so it's also used as a retention tool as well too for businesses. And I guess on that note, if the individual does leave, depending on how the agreements are written and what's been negotiated, they could be forfeiting those shares as well too if they leave prematurely before a particular date.
Yeah. So a lot of the times, not always, but a lot of the times, if your shares are still in that vesting period, you forfeit any shares that are in a vesting period. Yeah. Okay. Which can be a bit problematic, particularly when you're talking about performance bonuses. So you're getting a performance bonus, it may be significant. You don't necessarily have those shares. So you need to stick around until the end of the vesting period before you actually can leave the business and still take those shares with you.
Andrew, from a tax perspective, so this is something that I've come across personally with a few clients of late. From a tax perspective, it can get quite complicated. And in this instance, obviously, we always encourage people to go and get tax advice specifically. But one of the things that I've come across recently is that people have been, as part of an employee share scheme, have been given shares at a particular date at a particular value. And if the company does not perform, vesting period in this instance was 12 months. So 12 months later, they get access to the shares. They then have a tax event associated with those shares because they've decided to sell them or dispose of them or what have you. All of a sudden, their price that they got them at is up here. The price that they sold them at is down here. In terms of the capital gain that they've made on paper, they've made a capital gain because they didn't pay anything for the shares, but they don't have the cash because the shares aren't worth enough to be able to fund the tax associated with the capital gain. So it's actually worked out really badly and detrimental because the share price has been going backwards. So not only is there a tax consequence, which is fine if you've got the money to pay for it, but if the shares aren't worth enough to be able to cover it, it becomes a really big issue.
Yeah, it can be a very big issue. And so the general thing that I'm going to sort of throw out here with this is there are different tax events depending on how the business structures the share scheme. Mm-hmm. So it can be completely different from one business to another. And so you really need to take that into consideration. And in exactly that instance, you've got a significant risk that, by the time the vesting period finishes, your shares have declined in value and it's not even worth selling the share, so you have to hold on to it, which may not necessarily be the best thing for you. So first things first, the risk associated with the vesting period, you need to be comfortable that the business is going to be sustainable into the future and the business is going to perform and do well and the share price is going to reflect that. And then the second thing to take into consideration is, okay, well, what are the tax consequences associated with having these shares? Am I taxed at an income level when I receive the shares? Am I taxed when I eventually sell the shares? How does it specifically work with this exact share scheme? Because they can all be very different. Generally speaking, startups have more tax concessions than what established businesses do. So the government allows for some tax concessions with startups. But then you're also balancing out, okay, I've got some tax concessions, but, what are the risks of holding shares in a startup company? What's the likelihood that the business is actually going to continue and perform well? It's probably more risk associated with that than, being involved in a share scheme or an employee share scheme that is an established business that has a track record.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, look, just on the startup, I think it's easy to get caught up in, we all know that the tech companies, and you hear these stories and it was started out of someone's garage and it was, multi-billion-dollar unicorns and all this sort of stuff, right?
The janitors at Google that, made a bucket load of money because they had some employee share schemes and never sold it, and now it's worth millions.
I think the famous one that springs to mind is at Facebook's headquarters. You see it in that movie, The Social Network, that got made. They did a graffiti artist. I was going to say a spray painter. A graffiti artist came and did a mural in the offices of Facebook, and they didn't pay him in money. They paid him in shares. And if you look up the story or whatever, it was worth a whole heap of money. And anyway, that's the one that springs to mind from my end.
Similar story for the graphics designer that did the tick for Nike. I mean, it did a tick, so I think whatever you charged was a little bit overcharging there, but they got paid or part of the remuneration for doing the graphics design for it, because the business wanted to or didn't necessarily have the cash to pay a branding agency. They paid in some share options, and that worked out to be multi-million dollars because the person decided to just hold on to those shares and ride that wave.
Yeah. Well, where I was going to go is with the startup. So we've all got this idea and this notion about what has happened with some of these really well-known technology companies. But if you consider it from a perspective where you're taking a risk. If you're an employee, you're taking a risk on a business that probably, and from a probability perspective, the chips are stacked against you that the business is going to fail.
What, 9 in 10 businesses fail within the first 12 months?
Yep. And then you go and get given maybe not a market competitive salary per se, because costs for a startup are absolutely critical, and managing costs. So there's these employee share schemes that in the event that this pays off, and you look back, the opportunity is great. But the probability, and in all reality, that's going to go to zero. So you need to be comfortable, I think, if you're looking at an employee share scheme, at least with a startup business, that the probability of that going to zero is probably quite high. So you need to have a lot of faith and a lot of conviction that that's the right move for you, because you're probably making a sacrifice with your remuneration. And that's why there is an employee share scheme to help close that gap. And then knowing that you may be putting in time, effort and energy for a business to try and help increase the value of these shares that you've got that may end up going to zero because the business doesn't succeed.
Yeah, and exactly, to that point is also just the diversification that's associated with it. I mean, you've got, all of your personal assets, which is linked to your income, right? So you have an income that's coming in, which is generally being used to build personal assets outside of that. But the growth of those personal assets and the sustainability of those personal assets is linked to that income. Now you're actually holding more personal assets or additional assets in that same business that's linked to that same income, and it's some of the same risks that self-employed people face. In that, if you lose your business, not only do you lose a significant asset, but you also lose a significant income as well. So there's the diversification of linking your income and your assets essentially together, as opposed to what you normally try to do, and that's diversify and have that as separate as possible.
Yeah, I think it just comes down to being aware of sort of what's on the table, the pros and the risks associated with it, and ultimately feeling comfortable enough with the risk tolerance. And like what you said, it sounds very, very familiar to being a business owner, right? And I guess that's the whole idea and intent of these, is that you offer that as a business, as an employer, to try and get your people involved as business owners as well too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly right. But it all comes down to get advice. I mean, if a portion of your income is linked to something like this, you want to make sure that it's the right thing for you, and sometimes it's an option, so you can choose to, take the shares or take the salary. So make sure that you're getting advice and you're structuring things in a manner that's right for you and right for your circumstances.
Yeah. No, Andrew, I think that's a really good summary in terms of the pros and the cons associated with employee share schemes. Personally, with a few clients that we've got, actually, they're coming into the office today. We've seen this work really, really well.
Yeah.
In terms of they were involved in I think they're on their third employee share scheme. They're in a particular industry that offers those, but they've used that as an opportunity to really take those shares, convert them to cash. The share price was going up, but use that as a deposit to get into a property. Yeah. So in that instance, it worked really, really well, because outside of that, they probably wouldn't have been able to do it as quickly. So I've seen that work really, really well. And then on the flip side, I was having a conversation with a client last night where they thought their shares would be worth this, and now they're worth that. Plus, there's a tax consequence associated with it too.
Yeah.
So, I think getting advice is definitely the way to go. Just to know where you stand, go into these things eyes wide open, and pray for the best that the share price does continue to increase, because it can be life-changing. And on the other flip side of it, if it goes the other way, you can lose a little bit of time as well too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for everyone that tuned into the podcast today. If you liked the episode, subscribe, and we look forward to catching you on the next one. And if you wanted to discuss any of your circumstances, details are in the show notes to reach out to Billy and myself.
Cheers.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we talked about, or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
Just a reminder to our listeners that the information contained in this podcast is general in nature and is not intended as personal recommendations for the audience. Please consider whether the information suits your circumstances before acting on it. This information is provided by Billy Amiridis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Pty Ltd, authorized representatives and credit representatives of AMP Financial Planning.